So basically, we're going to talk about consciousness. So I'll start with three quotes. This is a quote by a British author. Consciousness is either inexplicable, it's an illusion, or else it's revelation. And I would characterize this as pessimistic, because basically it's saying that it's probably out of reach of our grasp, that we cannot understand consciousness. And this was I believe in the 19th century, so it was a while ago. Another quote is, all consciousness is consciousness of something. And this is by a philosopher more recent. And he seems to be an optimist. He seems to be implying that we can kind of get at consciousness and understand it. And this is the third quote I wanted to start with. So everybody is an expert on consciousness. Each of us seems to think I am an expert simply by being conscious. And this is actually, this is another philosopher. He gave a talk a few years ago, and he mentioned this, that he's been talking about consciousness for many years. And this is what he realized, that whenever he talks to people about consciousness, they seem to kind of ignore what he says, because, in his belief, everyone thinks that we know consciousness. And this is actually a very difficult aspect, because by relying on our personal subjective experience of consciousness, we're assuming that we understand it fully, and that's quite difficult to do. So these are three views. Let me just start with a slight humor. So last week I had my consciousness raised. Unfortunately, it passed out from vertigo. And so consciousness is not just a serious topic. We make fun of it all the time. So let me start with what's known as the hard problem of consciousness. And this is actually, it's a long-standing question around consciousness. For example, what is consciousness, right? Why do we have consciousness? Where in us does it exist? Okay, if it exists in us at all. When does consciousness emerge? These are some of the initial questions. Some of the more complex questions are, what does consciousness entail? What is necessary for it, right? What attributes does it exhibit in people? If it exists in animals, then what attributes does it exist in animals? And in general, if it's broader than just living things, then what attributes are part of consciousness? Is there more than one type or more than one level of consciousness? And also, there's a concept of qualia, which is from philosophy. And this is actually a direct way of trying to understand the quality of being conscious, the state of mind of being conscious, the experience of being conscious. That's known as qualia. So we'll go into some of these. So initially, first let's go into what is consciousness, right? So what is consciousness? First, we ask, why do we have consciousness, right? So I believe that consciousness is something that began in us biologically out of necessity. It arose through evolution. And we'll get into some of the aspects later, but right now, let me just, here I'm saying that we evolved aspects of consciousness at multiple times throughout our evolutionary life. And so what this kind of implies is that there are different types of consciousness. This is one of the questions that we asked initially, are there different levels? And the answer here is kind of implying that, yes, there may be multiple levels of consciousness. So one of the first levels of consciousness for evolutionary purposes was for organisms to recognize their surroundings, recognize what is around them. For example, food. All organisms need food. They need energy to survive. And they have to find and stay away from threats, from predators. So there's a physical characteristic of consciousness, which is the basic aspect of awareness that we all know, that consciousness is really fundamentally awareness at the basis level. And that began in very, very simple, even in very simple organisms, insects, and even before that, 500 million years ago. MYA stands for million years ago. And then after that, around 200 million years ago, more complex animals started to recognize, and these were mainly the lower. So, for example, reptiles and the lower mammals started to have the ability to recognize other animals. Are they friendly animals? Are they enemies of theirs? They also learned to work in cooperation with each other. And they learned what, I'll call sociality. There were aspects of it that were necessary for them to work together. And these, we can say, are aspects of consciousness, at least in the sense that you have to be conscious of another being nearby, or if there's no one nearby, you have to be aware of what other life form is nearby that has awareness, that has the lower level of awareness that the first bullet talks about. Then we looked at roughly 50 million years ago. Now the time period that I'm listing here is not actually, it's not written in stone, but also this time period is written from a perspective of a certain type of consciousness, and these varied depending on the type of animal, depending on the species. So don't look at the time periods as firm. These are just rough estimates to give you a relative ballpark of when development happened. So roughly 50 million years ago, when the more advanced mammals, they started to realize that they can shape their world, right? For example, a bear can find a cave in which to hibernate in. Okay? It is aware not only of the opportunity of finding shelter, but it's able to find the characteristic of a cave which has generally three sides to it, which protect it. It acts as protection. And this bear would have to have awareness that a cave would provide protection from three sides, and the opening would be left open. Other insects, for example, or rodents, they dig into burrows. So they have the ability to realize that the ground can be actually something that you can dig into. Now, these abilities are not necessarily conscious abilities in the sense that we're thinking. We don't believe that these animals are thinking cognitively that, yes, I need to make a decision of finding a location in the ground and digging in the location, or I need to find a cave now. They're not thinking in that sense, but at some level, they are thinking in the sense that they have to manipulate the world around them, or they have to interact with the world to be safe, right? And then roughly 1 million years ago, the more advanced hominids, which we humans are a part of, we started to gain also even more advanced versions of consciousness, which helped us to operate in a social world, social aspects. And this is where nurture starts to come in. So these social aspects, were very important. One of the things that we had to do was we had to learn to ignore stimuli around us, right? Because our brain, our human's brain, is picking up pretty much everything around us, but our brain is ignoring almost all of it at any given time, because there's so much information that goes into our brain that if we had to actively process and be aware of all of that information, it would be too much for our brain to handle. Even though our brain is quite complex and it has, roughly 86 billion neurons, that's still not enough. There's just too much information, too much real time. We're not talking about every second, we're talking about every microsecond that the brain is bombarded with information. And it just too much. So our brain has learned to ignore a lot of the information that's around us. And what that means is that we've also learned to focus at specific times on things that are important to us and things that may be problematic to us. We've learned to focus and attune not only on things around us, but also things inside of us. And we've also learned to do what's known as self-regulation. And this is something I'll go into later, but our current internal states and our moods are very important in consciousness. In consciousness, we are aware of how we feel, we are aware of how we're thinking. So these are important. Also, we are aware of our immediate future. What will happen in the next minute? What will happen in the next hour? What will happen in the next week? These are things that we are conscious of, aware of. And lastly, sharing of ideas. So once we have a thinking mind that can have thoughts inside of it, complex thoughts, then the ability to share these thoughts amongst other beings, other living beings, whether they're animals or other people, these are also aspects of consciousness. We have the ability to think in thoughts because we've developed this tool called language. And we are able to anticipate what the needs are of other people. Anticipation involves what's known as a theory of mind, and that's an aspect of consciousness. So these are all elements of consciousness that over time developed in us because they were necessary for us to function in more and more complex ways, because the world was getting more sophisticated. And for us to survive, for us to expand our ability to survive, we developed these abilities. Next, we're looking at where does consciousness exist, right? And so these are many questions. Do they exist in a specific cell or in a single neuron? Do they exist in a specific region of our brain or the entire brain? Is our brain and body combined? Does consciousness exist in our overall body? Does it exist through quantum forces? So there's some scientists who have raised this as a question. Do they exist in all cells of our body? And if so, does that mean that if they exist in quantum forces, does that mean that a rock at some level or inanimate objects at some levels can also have consciousness? Or why is it that rocks don't have consciousness? They don't exhibit consciousness if it occurs at the quantum level, yet in humans and some animals, they also occur. Why or do these quantum forces act in some areas and not act in other areas? That's a question that we'd have to answer if we subscribe to this view. Also, where does consciousness exist? Another way to look at it is maybe it exists throughout the universe. Maybe there's God. Maybe there's existence of consciousness. Maybe it's a fundamental aspect of reality and nature. There are scientists who think this. So some questions on that, if this is the case, is why is there a collective consciousness? Why is there a collective consciousness? Why are we restricted from reading others' minds? Right? If we have a collective consciousness, if it's overall combined into this everything, then why cannot we read the mind of other people? Why is it restricted, or why are we restricted? Is there a reason for that? Right? This also implies that consciousness exists throughout time. And if consciousness exists throughout time, we would have access to consciousness before we existed, in a sense. We would have access to all of our consciousness from the moment of our birth up to, the present, let's say, or even up to the future, past the future. That would be very confusing because all of time would become jumbled together. It would be very difficult for us to keep track of it, for our primitive mind in our brain that we have. Why do we lose consciousness sometimes? If the consciousness exists at all, everywhere, why is it important for us to lose consciousness then, right? And why do we have this illusion of individual consciousness? If it actually exists everywhere, why do we need to have this illusion that only we have consciousness that we have access to, and we cannot access other people's consciousness? So these are questions about where does consciousness exist. So let me get into so there are distinct areas of the brain that in studies we've found that possibly can hold where consciousness resides in the human brain. And these are known as attention networks. There are specific regions, and it's more than one region, and it's not understood fully yet. This is still an area of exploration. It's a very rich area of exploration. So we don't really understand it very well, but these are some of the likely things that we do understand. So most likely it's somewhere in the neural cortex. Some of you who don't have an understanding of the brain, the neural cortex is the most recent part of the human brain which evolved. It's the outer shell of our brain, the outermost area. The prefrontal cortex is part of it. It's also called the cortical region or the cortex. Neo means new, and cortex is the cortical region. So it's the newest, evolutionary-wise, it's the newest part of our brain. And it does exist in other animals, but humans have the largest neocortex, and it's the most complex. So, so the theory is that the attention networks, they exist somewhere in our neocortex, although they also work with other areas of our brain, but the actual attention portion or the consciousness portion of it is in the neocortex. There's also a problem in neurosciences called blind sight, and some of you may have heard of it, but I'll just describe it basically. And there's one particular study that I'll use to describe it. I don't have slides on this, but I can talk us through it. So there was and there are many different examples of this that have happened throughout time, where a person loses an ability in their brain. Usually what happens is there's a damage in their brain, or they have a disease, or something happens. They might have a stroke, for example. So there's a particular patient that had a stroke in her, I believe it was her right temporal region. It was the right part of her brain. And what happened was that she had lost the ability to notice, to see anything visually in the left part of her brain, because what our brain does is it maps, it crosses. The left part of our brain controls the right side of our body, and the right part of our brain controls the left part of our body. It's reversed. And that's normal in humans and many animals. So in her, because she had a stroke in the right part of her brain, her left eye could not see, but not just her left eye could not see. The way our visual system is structured is that both eyes send a part of its image to the left side of our brain, and both eyes send the right side of its vision field to our right to the left brain. So our eye actually divides itself. Our visual field is divided in very, very complex ways. It's actually, I don't want to get into that too much here, but it's very extremely complex. It gives us very sophisticated ability to think, to see. But what basically happens is that because our visual system is split up into multiple regions, in this patient, what happened after the stroke was that she could not see anything in the left side of anything. So, the neuroscientists studied this aspect. They were trying to understand exactly what happens. And what they noticed was that they would show her two pictures. Okay, one picture would be of a house. And if they would put the house, and she could only see the right part of the house. She could not see the left part of the house because part of her brain was damaged. So actually what she saw was she saw, if you see a picture of a house, only half of it would be there for her. That's what her awareness told her. Now, what they did is they had two versions of this picture of a house. They had a picture of a house where the house was normal. They had another version where the left side of the house was on fire. There were actual flames in the house, okay, in this picture. And what they noticed was that when she was shown, she was shown both pictures randomly at different times and asked to verbally describe what she felt about the picture. Would she want to go in the house or not? And what interestingly happened was that in pretty much every picture where there was no image of a fire in the house, she felt comfortable with the image. And pretty much every image where there was a fire in the house, she felt uncomfortable. Yet when she was asked to explain it, she came up with arbitrary reasons. She could not explain it. She did not have a rational understanding of why. But what that told the scientists doing this study was that there is a part of her brain which realized that the fire was there, even though her visual system could not see the fire in the image. She was asked to draw the image. Basically, the images that she drew only had the right part of the house. It did not even contain the left part of the house, let alone the fire. And they did other things to ensure that she was not able to see the fire. And then what they did is they continued, and eventually they started realizing that part of her brain was aware of the emotional aspect of the house being on fire, because that's an emotional event, right? If we see a house on fire, most of us would at some very, very deep level, at a probably imperceptible to us, but psychologically it would be very deep in us, we would have concern that this house is on fire. And that's what happened in her. But that concern was very deep, and she was not aware of it. She did not have any understanding of it. And this is known as a blind sight problem. And this actually dealt with the visual cortex primarily, but what it did is it opened up, in exploration, it opened up the possibility that awareness and consciousness is more than just visual. It's much more complex and involves multiple regions of the brain. And so there are various researchers who did this. I won't go into a lot of this because I want to keep, also have discussion on this. That's one of the benefits of having these talks, is we get to have very interesting discussions with everyone. So I'd like also all of you to maybe think of questions as I talk, for you that we can discuss. There are two other reasons that I listed here: superior temporal sulcus and the temporal parietal junction. These are other areas that in various areas of research have been found to involve what's known as the theory of mind, which is the understanding that we have a mind and that other beings have a mind. That's in a simple sense, that's the theory of mind, and that other people's minds don't have to necessarily have exactly what our mind has. For example, if I believe in something, another person's mind may not believe in that. That's a theory of mind. And that actually arises in children around the age of 4. Children before the age of 4 don't have a theory of mind. They believe that what's in their mind exists in everyone's mind. So if they see something, they believe that everybody sees it. They're not aware that we have individual perceptions of reality. Also, the concept of perception and the concept of self versus other. These seem to be associated with these regions. There are other reasons. I didn't want, there would be roughly 10 or 15 different regions that have been found so far. The problem is that all of these regions are not conclusive. We don't know for sure if they are completely responsible for consciousness or they present some aspect of our awareness. Exactly what? One thing we do know is that the midbrain and the hindbrain, the cerebellum, which are the earliest parts of our of the human brain, these probably are not principal elements of the higher advanced features of consciousness. They are there for the lower levels of consciousness that we described earlier about simple perception and awareness of things in our environment. But the higher forms of consciousness more than likely are not part of the hindbrain and the midbrain. They are pretty much in the neural cortex, as I described in the first bullet. So there's a lot of research going on, and these will continue. Right at this point, we really don't know where in our brain consciousness exists, but there are a lot of studies that have been going forth. Next slide I want to do is I have a sequence of slides where I want to talk about when does consciousness emerge, right? So first we'll talk about throughout the animal kingdom, right? So the three columns. The left column is the type of animal. The middle column is that do we believe that they have conscious awareness, and the right column describes whether those animals are able to interact with the world, whether they can have intent in the world. And this is important because intent is a concept that's important in consciousness. So bacteria, we know, don't have conscious awareness. Now, I'm saying no as if we're certain. Now, theoretically, it's possible that they do, depending on some of the theories that we subscribe. But most scientists, for that matter, say the bacteria don't have consciousness, primarily because even if they, they're too close to inanimate objects, even though they're living, to have consciousness. Insects, do they have consciousness? No, but they do interact with the world. They have intentional interaction with the world. For example, an insect moves to a specific location because it wants to move there. There may be food, or there may be, it's a habitat, so it moves with intent. Fish and octopuses, they seem to exhibit slight levels of consciousness, conscious awareness. And these are the more earlier levels of awareness that we talked about that evolved through evolution. And all of these animals definitely interact with the world. Porpoises, birds, mammals, they show even higher levels of consciousness and awareness. And porpoises and birds and mammals actually show a lot of signs of intelligence, many of the very similar signs of intelligence that humans do. And as part of that, they show, we might extrapolate that they show signs of possibly higher forms of consciousness, but definitely they show the lower forms of consciousness. So these are the animals. Let's look at humans. So in people, when we're dead, we definitely don't show any signs of conscious awareness, and we don't have any intent. We don't move with intention. When we're sleeping, similarly, we don't show any conscious awareness, and we don't have any intention. We're basically inanimate in a sense. When we're dreaming, we don't seem to show awareness, although some people who are known to have lucid dreams, lucidity of their dreams may be a form of consciousness, or probably is a form of consciousness, because lucidity involves awareness. But they don't have intention because they can't move. They're not able to move. Our body is physically paralyzed. Our brain physically paralyzes our body during sleep to prevent us from doing accidental things. Now, sleepwalking is an example where that mechanism where the brain paralyzes the body doesn't work. That mechanism fails in some people, and then they're able to sleepwalk. And what sleepwalking is a real phenomenon. It's very well established. It's documented. It's not pseudoscience or anything. And what happens with sleepwalking is that the person, from all practical purposes, is not aware that they're conscious. Is not aware that they're sleepwalking. They're not even aware that they are doing anything. When asked later, they have no concept of sleepwalking. They have no awareness of it, and they're not in REM sleep, so they're not even dreaming at that point. So it's not that the dream state is taking over. It's that their brain is really inactive in a different way. It's somehow between the waking state and the higher levels of the dreaming state, where you're not in a REM sleep and you're not actively dreaming. So it's a strange area of the sleep state. And what happens is that those people are able to walk. They're able to do anything. There actually have been cases where, at least one very famous case, I forget, it was in a different country, in a European country, where this person actually drove their car in a sleepwalking state. They drove their car to their in-laws' house. They murdered one of their in-laws. They got back in their car. Actually, they murdered their in-law, and then they woke up at the scene of the crime, and they couldn't explain it. They couldn't understand it. And their defense was that they were in a sleepwalking state. And psychiatrically, this is understood, and they were not prosecuted. They were found innocent because this was an illness, a physical illness in their brain, which caused this, although it was unfortunate. So sleepwalking is a very strange case, but it shows that a person can be unconscious totally, yet they still have intention. Okay? Next is when we're waking up from sleep, when we are asleep and we are waking up from that. This is an area that we're partially conscious. We may be in a fuzzy, hazy state. We may have kind of awareness that, oh, we were dreaming, we just woke up and now we're seeing the world around us. We start to look around us and see, where am I, right? And this may happen after a surgery, after you're under anesthesia. It probably will be more significant because you've been out for longer and the effects of anesthesia are stronger. So it kept you, unconscious in a deeper way. So what happens is that when you're partially in a state of awareness, you have to kind of look around with the world and figure out where you are. What day is it? Who are the people? Why am I here? How did I get here? These are all concepts that arise when we're waking up. Although typically from a normal sleep, it's you went to sleep the night before, you have memory of that. So, and you're in the same bed, probably. So, and as far as intention, we have slight intention. For example, we can move our head, we can move our eyes, we can look around. We have intent. So we're starting to get back our consciousness after we wake up. When we're fully awake, when we're involved in some activity, okay, when we're really intent on doing something, a lot of times we have a level of consciousness in the sense that we subconsciously know that we're alive. In the back of our mind, we know that we exist. In the back of our mind, we are aware of many things about us, but our mind is really not thinking about that. Our mind is engaged in some activity. For example, we may be exercising, we may be doing grocery shopping, we may be driving, we may be doing something, and we're focused on that, and our mind is focused only about that. Our mind is not thinking about anything else, right? Yet at the back of our mind, we have an awareness. So in that sense, we have a partial sense of consciousness. And at those times, if we're exercising, yes, we do have intention. We're manipulating weights and things in the world. So we have intent. We are actively working in the world. And the last point is that there's a higher level of consciousness when we're actually thinking about our own consciousness. We're aware of our consciousness. Many of you right now may be at that state where you're contemplating, what is consciousness? What does it mean to be consciousness? And this is the highest form of consciousness. So this we can definitely say, yes, we are definitely aware at its fullest sense of consciousness, and we're showing intention. So these are varying forms of consciousness in people. So these two slides, the previous slide with animals and this next slide with people, these show that consciousness can range. It's not a fixed on or off. It's not that consciousness always exists or always does not exist. They're actually partial states of consciousness. And consciousness has more than just the awareness of being conscious. It also has the intentional, because this aspect of sleepwalking, this aspect of the blind sight problem, these demonstrate that consciousness actually involves intention also. It's a very important part of consciousness, that if you're conscious but you're not intent, you're not acting with intention, are you really conscious? And many people believe that no, you're not. There's a third slide here which I'm going to go into, and this is also about people. This goes into, when does consciousness emerge in people? Right? We're born as people, and so when throughout our lifetime does consciousness emerge? Because obviously before conception, we don't exist. But at the time after conception, at some point between conception and between death, consciousness emerges and then it stays. So this is an example where the first three talk about before our birth in the womb. The first trimester seems to be no, that we don't have consciousness and we don't have intention, because one, the brain has not formed. The brain is at such a nascent level of formation that there are hardly enough brain cells, and the physical aspect of the brain and the body has not formed enough. In the second trimester, it's beginning to, but still it's not formed at a level enough. The third trimester, which is the 7th, 8th, and 9th months of pregnancy, it's possible, and it may be that it's barely emerging, but intention, whether that infant, whether that fetus or prenatal baby is really doing anything with intent, we believe probably not. Almost no intention, because again, the baby doesn't have, from what we understand, it doesn't have an awareness of the world that it's in or where it is. It does sense things. Its sensory perceptions, especially toward the end of the third trimester, is able to sensate. It's able to get sensations from even throughout the womb. For example, sounds and vibration and orientation. It can sense to some extent, but we don't believe that it really has any intention. It's not able. It doesn't even know that it is able to do anything. It doesn't have muscular control, for example. Now, the first day after birth, okay, That's the point at which it's legally a baby, it's recognized it's a human being. Does it have consciousness? So we believe it's starting to emerge. We don't believe it has full consciousness because we know that a baby can't do many things that a fully conscious adult can do, right? It doesn't know about itself. It doesn't know about anyone else around it. It can't think in many complex ways. So we say that it's emerging. Whether it has intention or not, very similar, because just as in the womb, it really doesn't have an ability to move itself. It doesn't have an ability to even focus. Its eyes have not developed to a point where it has the ability to focus, use its muscles in the eye to focus the lens. So a baby is actually not blind, but its visual ability is very, very diminished the first few months, roughly the first 2 or 3 months. So, and obviously we know that it can't move its arms. It may flail its arms and legs, but those are more autonomous type of activities, just as crying is an autonomous activity in a baby. So it doesn't have intention, or very, very little intention, if any. The first month we start to see a lot more of this happening. And by the first baby, we tend to see a lot of the lower level forms of consciousness develop in pretty much every baby, although the higher levels of consciousness, which are the more abstract esoteric areas of the ability to think about oneself, that hasn't developed, because a 1-year-old baby probably doesn't have language or the sophisticated skills you need to get into these things. So these are the hard problem of consciousness. So we talked about the first part. The second part is, what does consciousness entail? Okay. So let's get into that. So what is necessary for consciousness? So consciousness requires a living brain. Okay, so just summarizing some of the things that we've learned so far, that we understand so far. Consciousness requires a living brain. Now, we don't know what living means, but let's just take for granted that we at some level can ascertain exactly what's a living brain versus not. It requires a sufficient brain, meaning a brain with sufficient neural complexity, and the brain has to be developed up to a certain point. Again, sufficient is a vague term, but and we're not going to. Now, another thing I want to say is that the talk today is, we're not going to do an exhaustive study on this today. This is an introductory exploration. We may go into this topic in more depth later on in subsequent talks. And that's the reason why I want to do this as an introduction to consciousness. So any questions you have in some of these areas, we may go into in more depth later, if there's interest. But what is a sufficient brain may be something that neuroscientists are very much interested in, and there's a lot of research going on in this. But for today, we're not going to delve into this part much. It requires intention, meaning it requires the acting with intention. This is something that we've seen, because a person who's sleepwalking does not have intention. Although they're able to, they do have intention, but they're not able to be aware of what they're doing. They don't have awareness. Next is, it requires awareness of something. And this is where a person sleepwalking, they're not aware. And what it means to have awareness of something, we're not really sure yet, right? What is this something that we have to have awareness of? There are different levels of this. That what we understand is, at least we have to have an awareness of our existence in the world, that we have a physical body. That seems to be an awareness that the higher forms of animals eventually have an awareness of. The insects, for example, probably are not aware that their body exists, because their eyes, for example, and their sensory systems cannot visually grasp the entire body. It cannot see its own body. Even if it went into a mirror, most simpler animals, if they see themselves in a body, don't recognize it's their own body. They see it as another animal. They're not aware of their existence. So when we say we have to be aware of something, this something is pretty complex and varies depending on the type of animal that you are, how sophisticated your level of consciousness is. That determines the type of something, determines what type of consciousness you have. And lastly, consciousness seems to have levels. Now, we talked about the basic level, which is the physical awareness of consciousness, that we exist, things exist, and we have perception through our visual system. We have auditory and other types of sensory experiences that give us an awareness. And then there's the more advanced level, which is that we can conceptualize the ability to think. We can conceptualize the existence of our body and the non-existence of our body. And we can conceptualize through space and time when we cease to exist or not. So there are various types of consciousness that seem to be true. So all of these exist in humans, and some of these exist in vertebrates, the higher forms of animals. So there's this concept of qualia, okay, in consciousness that we talked about earlier. first, what is qualia? Qualia is the simplest way to describe it is, and qualia is a term in philosophy. It's a state of being. It's an aspect of our mental lives that deals with the introspective, accessible phenomenology, meaning that we have to be able to be introspective, to look inside of ourselves. So we're talking about the human consciousness. We're talking about animal consciousness here. This is the more advanced form of consciousness for human beings. So we have to be introspective, meaning we have to be able to look inside of ourselves. We have to be able to understand what's happening in us, right? In our body as well as in our mind. Accessibility is important in qualia, that we have to have access to different things, different information. We have to have access to information in the world outside of us. We have to have access to information inside of our body. So for example, if we feel sick, okay, or if we feel like we may, we have a pain in our body, or we feel like we're drowsy, this is information that our brain can access and get, a sense of. And it does it by accessing our body and also accessing different parts of our mind. So our brain has different regions. And again, I won't assume that everybody has an understanding of neuroscience, but one part of our brain can access another part of our brain. This is important to understand, that it's not that our brain is a single homogeneous entity. Our brain consists of billions of neurons, and it consists of networks of neurons. And there's a talk that I did recently where, if you want, you can go into that and it'll give you a little bit of understanding. But we have regions of our brains consisting of networks of neurons that act independently and together, both. And so the accessibility of information that our brain needs to do is intrinsic in us, in humans, and in some of the higher animals, that they can access one part of the brain, can access another part of the brain, or one part of the brain can access part of the body, or one part of the brain can access the senses or the sensory part of our experience. So this is accessibility. And phenomenologically, human consciousness is something that we're aware of. Okay? We experience it, we know it. So all of these together are an aspect of our mental lives. They form what we call a state of being. Now, the key concept here is mental lives. Okay? Our mental lives have to do with feelings and experiences and awareness. This is at the lower level. And animals probably show these aspects of mental lives, that they have feelings, they have physical emotions, and they have possibly mental emotions. They have experiences, meaning they perceive things in the world, and they can interact with what they perceive. And they have awareness. They have an understanding that, yes, there's a threat in front of them, or yes, there's food in front of them. They have an awareness of the things in the world. Also, there's a subjective, and the second column is more with humans, that there's a subjective element to our mental lives, that we understand ourselves as thinking beings. Our mental lives, it's distinctive, that it's not linked with other beings, that my sense of my consciousness is distinct from your sense of your conscious understanding. And it's self-recognizable, that I can recognize at various times in my life, I can recognize whether I'm conscious or not. And this self-recognizable nature, and actually all of these natures, vary from a almost non-existent state to partial existence to more sophisticated existence to full existence at different times in our lives. So this is our mental state. So we talked about the different levels of consciousness, about our being awake, about acting with intention, about knowing our actions. These are the basic levels of consciousness that we and many animals exhibit. And then we talked about the advanced levels of consciousness, knowing our state of mind. This has to do with mainly knowing the mind. What is the mind? Knowing our mind and understanding our mind, and knowing our mental abilities, knowing ourselves, knowing other minds, that other minds exist, and knowing that they have mental abilities. And then there may even be higher forms of consciousness that we haven't studied yet, but philosophers and scientists and people in general have thought about, that the concept of nirvana, of self-actualization. Is there such a thing as super consciousness? Okay. Well, we see that as we evolve further, as we go into artificial intelligence, and we might merge artificial intelligence with our human body and combine us. Well, we have augmented AI, which gives us a more advanced form of consciousness. These are things that we obviously won't talk about, but consciousness may be much more than what we realize even today. So let me just stop here. So this is just a simple joke, that there's a patient who was undergone surgery, and the doctor is telling probably the patient's wife that yes, he's regained consciousness, but he doesn't want to see him, wants you to see him like this. So the patient is self-conscious about his consciousness. So there's a little bit of a humor here. So let's stop here and go into some questions and answers.
Excellent. Folks, so we have a number of people on the call. So we've got 4 rules to make possible really good interaction with this many number of people. Rule number 1, type exclamation mark when you want to ask questions. Rule number 2, keep it on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule number 4, feel free, speak your mind, feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. At this stage, we are taking only questions. We've got a hard time limit at 2:30, so I want to make sure that we get as many questions. So keep your questions very brief, no comments, no commentary, no views. You'll have chance for that later. Right now, just questions. So it's going to be Ash, Leslie, Linda, Cotton, Rich, Lisa, Bill, Vanessa, and X. All right, Ash, go ahead.
Hi, hello again, Sanjay, and thank you again. So you're probably familiar to some extent with a theory proposed by Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, along with a neuroscientist named Christoph Koch. In 1990, they published a paper called Towards a Neurobiological Theory of Consciousness, where they propose a theory in response to the binding problem, in which consciousness arises from a certain synchronization of neural activity that serves to integrate our experience among the relevant neural networks. Sorry, I'll keep this really brief. I just have a quick passage, like 2 sentences. So they write, our basic idea is that consciousness depends crucially on some form of rather short-term memory and also on some form of serial attentional mechanism. This attentional mechanism helps sets of the relevant neurons to fire in a coherent semi-oscillatory way, probably at a frequency in the 40 to 70 hertz range, so that a temporary global unity is imposed on neurons in many different parts of the brain. These oscillations then activate short-term working memory. So my question is just, what do you think are there merits and or problems with this theory? Do you know of any studies that have been done in recent decades to support or disconfirm this type of theory or binding by synchrony theories of consciousness in general?
All right, folks, let me remind you, please keep your questions brief. There are 20 people lined up for questions. I want to get as many questions as possible. Sorry about that, Ash, but please keep everybody keep your questions brief. So, Sanjay, over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Ash. Yes, I voted with that paper in 1990, and I did read it. I read most of it again recently. And so Crick, so let me just give a little background. So at that time in the neurosciences, that was the earlier period in neurosciences. It was 30 years ago. And a lot of what we understand today was not known back then. That was actually the beginning. Neuroscience really started looking to consciousness around the 80s. And so that was a fairly early time period. We did not have a lot of data. We did not have a lot of understanding of it. But it was a fairly important study because it started to focus and actually gave credence to the idea of studying consciousness. Because prior to that, the study of consciousness in the neurosciences was frowned upon. It was not considered acceptable because it was considered too wild or too bizarre a problem. But that paper actually opened the door for many neuroscientists. Now, the problem that Francis Crick and Koch had at that time was that there were not a lot of reputable, strong data to help them along. And so they relied on a lot of the visual studies of the visual system and such. I do agree with what they said in the paper, although what they said in the paper has been enhanced since then. And it was a good paper because it did start to introduce some of the real issues with consciousness, though it didn't go into a lot because at that time, they also didn't understand a lot. It was early time period.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, we got many people lined up for questions. So let's keep the questions and answers as brief as possible so we can get as many people to chime in as possible. So it's going to be Leslie, Linda, Kate, Rich, Lisa, Bill, Vanessa, EX, John, and John, Tyson, and Gail next. Leslie, go ahead.
Thanks. My question is about how much awareness people have when they're sleepwalking. I'm a serious sleepwalker, and I once smashed a window with my fist. When I was asleep, I knew I was standing in front of a window. I thought that smashing the window was the only way to save my life, to escape. and I deliberately smashed the window, and then I woke up with shooting pain. So I knew what I was doing. I was just misperceiving the need to do it. Does that fit with what you said about the lack of consciousness we have when we're sleepwalking? Because I knew what I was doing. I was just not assessing risk accurately.
So yes, so excellent question. Thank you for raising that. So this gets into the difference between intention and awareness, right? So awareness of your state of mind, because we're talking about the more advanced part of consciousness. We're not talking about the simpler. So intention is the idea that you were doing, you understood at one level of your mind, you understood what you were doing, meaning you understood that you were going to break a window, and you had the ability, your mind had the ability to manipulate the muscles, to send appropriate signals to your muscles of your arms, probably, maybe to lift an object, because I don't know if you did it through your fist or using some object, but somehow your brain was manipulating your body to exercise intent to break that window. Yet your mind did not want to, one level of your mind wanted to break the window, but another level of your mind did not want to break the window. I'm not sure if, I think you understand it, but I'm not sure if other people will understand the difference there. Your awareness of the world that you were in did not include your awareness that you were sleepwalking, right? So that's what I'm saying when I say that sleepwalkers typically don't understand, they don't have a full awareness of the world that they're in. They're not aware that their state of mind is in a state of partial sleep. That, and sleepwalkers, there are different types of sleepwalkers. Some sleepwalkers don't have any sense of what they're doing. I actually had one episode in my entire life so far of where I sleepwalked, and I actually had been in a hotel room, and I had been, it was a temporary apartment that I had stayed in for a few weeks, so I was familiar with the layout. I walked to the bathroom at night, and I stubbed my foot very, very painfully, and then I woke up. But I was able to basically navigate through this house without understanding that I was doing that, without being awake or conscious. So anyway, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but it does show the difference between cognitive consciousness and intentional behavior.
Okay, next up is going to be Linda, Kate, and Rich. Linda.
How does neuroscience explain that some patients after receiving surgery under anesthesia can recall the surgery both audibly and visually?
I'm not as familiar with the visual part. The audible part is easier to explain. Well, actually, they both are easy to explain in one sense, but it depends on, because when you say some people are able to recount the surgery visually, I've heard reports of people talking about out-of-body experiences, which is a visual form of recounting, right? So, but out-of-body experience is not through their own eyes. It's through another set of eyes floating in space, right? So that's the part that I won't get into, because that seems implausible, or there would not be a simple neurological explanation for that. But the neurological explanation for using our own senses, using our eyes and using our ears, are that even when we're unconscious, our brain is not off. Our brain never is turned off. Our brain is always on. And so what happens during anesthesia and sleep is that the one part of our brain which we believe gives us the perception of consciousness is inactivated, but other parts of our brain are still active. And that's the reason why, for example, our auditory system is still active, our visual system, if our eyelids are open, we'd be able to see things, as far as, we'd be looking up, probably we're on an operating table, we'd be looking up at the ceiling, we would be able to see that ceiling. So our brain would be able to store those experiences. That's possible.
Okay, Sanjay, these are fantastic questions. So I'm going to make sure that we get time for questions. And then even if we have to cut short the second presentation, let's do that. Let's take all the questions. It's amazing questions. So next up is Cotton, Rich, and Lisa. Cotton, go ahead.
Yes, so Sanjay, thank you. My question is regarding the blind sight, when the person only saw kind of perceived that fire in the left or right side of the house. Like, do the neuroscientists only kind of accept 5 senses? Like, because what about things like, could that perception of awareness non-visually perception of the fire be something in the kind of in the vein of intuition, because we're our mind, our our sensors are limited by, let's say, the electromagnetic spectrum, which is very limited. So how do you guys treat things that are kind of outside what we can perceive?
Yeah, excellent question. So neuroscientists are aware that the brain has more than 5 types of senses. Now, we typically believe that the human brain has only 5 senses, but in animals, we know that they have other types of senses. For example, we know that sharks and many types of fish and actually some other animals have these sensors which are able to sense electrical activity, actual electricity nearby, and that's how they used to hunt. We know that birds have a sense which is paramagnetic. They are able to sense the magnetic field of the Earth, of the planet. Now, we believe that these senses in humans probably evolved out of us. Now, we may have remnants of those in us at some level, but we're not able to find them. We're not able to see any evidence of those. So the studies that neuroscientists do is that they're not saying that there is no other sense other than 5. It's just that we are fully aware of and we can study 5 senses, and that's the reason why the studies involve those 5 senses.
Next up is Rich, Lisa, and Bill.
Yes, thank you, Sanjay. You had mentioned earlier that during sleep, the body is paralyzed, but people do, I believe, toss and turn. The sleepwalking types of episodes you mentioned, you actually are moving. So I'm assuming this type of paralysis is limited or relates only certain conditions. Is that correct?
No, so actually sleep itself is a very complex set of states. It's not just one state. So many of you may know that when we're sleeping, we actually go through different phases of sleep, right? So when we initially start, we're in a lucid. I don't remember all of the different details of the sleep states, but I believe there are 3 states that we go through, and the deepest level of sleep is when our body gets paralyzed. Our body is not paralyzed in the upper 2 levels of sleep. And the upper 2 levels of sleep are levels where we may have some sense of awareness of what's around us. For example, if somebody nudges us, we may have some sense of that. And again, it depends on person. It varies from person to person. But yes, the paralysis is at the deepest level of sleep when we're dreaming, because when we're dreaming, our mind is fully active, almost the same as when we're awake. And the problem biologically is that if our brain is active and interacting with, it thinks it's interacting with the world as if it's awake. If our body was not paralyzed, and we see this in people who have this physiological condition, their body actually will act out the dream state. That if they're running, they will actually be in kind of a motion as if their body is physically running. So that's the reason
Folks,
inhibits that.
thank you. Folks, we are not going to do follow-ups so that we can get as many questions in as possible. So it's going to be Lisa, Bill, Vanessa, X, John, Tyson, Gail, Bob, Sarika, Caesar, and Jyoti next. Lisa, go ahead.
Sanjay, in the context of Buddhism, consciousness is often talked about in terms of awareness. You threw out the word intent, awareness. If mindfulness of meditation can actually increase awareness or consciousness, one of the ways we're trying to define consciousness, is that relevant or insightful? If we can increase consciousness, maybe we can get closer to a definition.
Yeah, so neuroscience has looked at mindfulness, not extensively. It's one of the areas that it's looking at pretty broadly now. I did a talk on it a few weeks ago. Again, an introductory talk, because these talks are short form and they're more for conversation. But if anybody wants to have more depth, we can definitely do more. Basically, yes, neuroscience has found that the level of our brain's ability to interact with the world, and at whatever level you want to say, okay, whether it's at the most basic level, primal level, or at the more advanced, sophisticated levels, we see that the brain can enhance its abilities through mindfulness. And one of the important things is it's actually used in many types of therapy for people. So yeah.
Thank you.
So next up is Bill. Bill, go ahead.
Yes. Sanjay, you have used the term aware in more than one way. You have spoken of a person's being aware of his or her world, being aware of things going around them. You've also spoken of a person's being aware that they exist. Please explain how these two senses of the term aware are related.
So every sense of the word awareness that I used has to do with that. There's a sentence that I had in one of the slides that talked about awareness of something. So awareness that they exist is the same, is basically meaning the same. It's just the words are different, but it means the exact same thing. It's awareness of their own existence, right? So if someone is aware that they exist, same thing as being aware of their existence. It is the same thing. At least I believe so.
Next up is Vanessa.
Yeah, you kind of broached upon it earlier, like when you're talking about non-humans, like a dog, maybe it's that magnetic change in the air, how they know a thunderstorm is coming. You know, they're cowering, and like 5 minutes later, what do you know? You hear lightning. And even like birds, how they suddenly flock and try to get to the tree, like when you know something. All right, what do they know that I don't know? And even a sunflower, like a sunflower feels the heat and like will move with the direction of the sun. Like, you know, even at a very maybe fundamental basic level, it seems like even, you know, it's a living creature, you know, like such as a plant. And even lobsters, when the change in the temperature up in Maine, you get the soft shell and the hard shell. They know, you know, okay, it's going up to, let's say, 55 degrees, time to shed the shell. You know, would that be considered awareness or like consciousness?
Yeah. So let me, the 3 questions. I'll try to do this quickly. So with plants, when plants orient themselves toward the light, you know, that's not really a mind. There's no mind. There's no neural cells in a plant. Now, I'm limiting this to neuroscience. There are many ways of looking at this philosophically, but in neuroscience, there's no neural cells in a plant. They are not intentionally moving themselves toward the sun. What happens is the growth pattern of certain cells, of certain eukaryotic cells in the plant, are amplified in one direction based on increased energy availability. It's more complex, but basically the plant, it's the biology of the plant that causes it to move toward the sun. When animals are able to sense the environment or a thunderstorm coming or a tsunami, things like that, what happens is a lot of these types of catastrophic events actually occur. There are vibrations on the planet. They are very extremely low frequency of vibrations below 1 hertz or vibrations below 10 hertz. And many animals are able to perceive sound far below our auditory ability. I mean, we can perceive sound at some level when we sense it, when we feel it. Like if you touch a vibrating table, you can feel it. That's a vibration. But below a certain level, we're not able to sense vibration, whereas animals can. And there's vibrations in the air also. So these are reasons why animals can sense. We believe these are reasons why animals can sense some of what happens in nature.
Next up is EX, John, and Tyson. EX, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm really interested in the idea of the interaction of different parts of the brain actually then causing consciousness. And you mentioned the idea of the neocortex as being one of the loci of consciousness. And there have also been kind of studies that tie in the importance of more fundamental interoceptive systems in the construction of self and how that heightens a sense of self and consciousness. And I was really interested in this idea of the interaction between the brainstem, the neocortex, and how actually maybe it's located in a complex way across many networks. And would love to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so actually the last sentence you said is actually accurate. It's believed to exist across a multiple set of regions in the brain. It's not localized, but there seems to be a localized control center, you might say. But the action, and also we have to remember that the concept of consciousness occurs at multiple levels. So depending on which aspect of consciousness we're talking about, they seem to embody different regions of the brain. This is something we're not going to get into this topic because this is introductory, but I do want to do a talk on that later to delve more into it. Yes.
Excellent. Next up, and great question. Next up is John, Tyson, and Gail. John.
Hey, Sanjay. Excellent talk. A lot to think about. So one of the things I've been really curious about is, and you sort of touched on, is sort of consciousness in sort of non-human form or even non-animal form. Like we sort of touched on rocks, like whether rocks are conscious or not, and it sort of starts to become, well, what does consciousness mean? But also, when talking about the sleepwalking, where certain systems are online and are you aware, or are your intention? I guess my question is, to what degree is consciousness contain other consciousnesses? Like, for instance, we sort of have talked up to the human level, but what about groups of humans? Like, for example, our eyes are sort of connected to our brain, I think, like are actually exposed. And we're all in a group right now, and we're all interacting with each other. We're all firing neurons and receiving light and interacting, and there's an executive function in Srikant. And so you could say, in some level, like, this group is in some way conscious. And I'm just wondering, does it propagate up? And how much would is that something that neuroscience would consider or think as valid? And if so, how and what area would neuroscience sort of be concerned with that?
Okay, yeah. So what you're talking about is metaconsciousness. And metaconsciousness is beyond just simple consciousness of individual brain or individual person or individual mind. Neuroscience doesn't study this or look at this, at least actively. There probably are some that consider it, but it's an area that we cannot study right now because we don't understand a single brain well enough to be able to study it across brains. But in areas of psychology and other areas of the cognitive fields, we do look at it, we understand it, but it's very experimental. It's very difficult to study.
Okay, next up is Tyson, Gail, Bob, Sarika, Cesar, Jyoti, and Kate. So Tyson, go ahead.
So I wanted to ask about the blind sight experiment. So what do you think about the interpretation that her left visual cortex was not entirely knocked out, that it was only the part involved with attentional awareness? And so this is evidence that the assessments of a burning house being dangerous does not require conscious intervention. And so a non-conscious animal could also make that assessment, which seems objectively true.
Very good question. So let me explain that from the point of view of how science works, or what are the things that some of the tools that science uses. So I don't know particularly in that study or not what they did. I suspect they did because it was a reputable study and it was looked at by many others, and they found it to be well done. Typically in a well done study, what is done is that you do understand that these may be possible flaws in your theory. So what you do is you have additional efforts, you have additional work that's done. So for example, in that study, what they may have done, I don't know if they did, but they may have done is they may have actually studied her visual system on its own without anything else, without the concept of her awareness or without the concept of emotional activation, anything like that. So, and there are many types of instrumentation which we have to basically excite specific areas of the visual region, okay, either through photonically or through direct stimulation of the brain. And what I suspect is that a very simple way, for example, even without any sophisticated tools, is you can throw a ball at somebody from their left side, right? And if they have visual perception from their left side, they will see the ball emerging and they will move their head away, right? Because nobody wants to be hit, okay? And you can do the same from the right side. And you can run a randomized trial where they don't know what's going to happen. You don't even tell them that a ball is going to be thrown at them, or you might warn them that something will happen. So be cautious, we're not going to hurt you, or it'll be a soft Nerf ball, that you won't be hurt. We have to use ethics in our studies. So, but basically you can study it in many different ways and understand that for the brain to really act in certain ways, the visual system has to be activated and no other system has to be activated. And so it's able to parse out elements of what is actually causing the behavior that we're seeing. And I suspect in that study they had done that.
Next up is Gail, Bob, and Sarika. Gail, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I'm looking at my question again, wondering if I asked it appropriately, but my question is why, if animals have that level of consciousness and we're aware of it, how is it that we can exploit them rather than treating them not necessarily as an equal, and I think what I was really thinking more so along the lines of is consciousness as opposed to, or consciousness as opposed to conscious.
Right. I mean, conscious and consciousness from a neuroscientific perspective or from many scientific perspectives are kind of the same thing. I understand we can make distinctions, but you know, the question is, and scientists also understand that there are multiple levels of consciousness, right? So that's some of the things that I was trying to present earlier. So animals don't seem to have the highest levels of consciousness that we perceive. For example, we can't see any evidence that they are aware of themselves having a brain because they can't see a brain. They're aware of things that they can perceive, but if they can't perceive something, they can't, even if they're shown a picture of a animal, of the same species animal with a brain, they don't necessarily understand that that's a model of their own body. So there are many things that they are not aware of. So the question you're asking is more around empathy of why do we mistreat animals or possibly even eat animals and things like that. That gets into empathy, but I suspect it's because our rules for empathy are driven around human perception, right? Or on human cognition and human thought. And we humans tend to elevate ourselves above all other living things, all of the other forms of beings and all of the other matter for that matter. So in a sense, our ethics is human-centric ethics. If we took a different sort of ethics that was animal-centric or life-centric or wider, maybe we wouldn't do that.
Next up is going to be Bob, Sarika, and Cesar. Bob, what's your question?
If idiot savants have consciousness, can a smart computer be said to have consciousness? Because you could think of them as both having brains.
Yeah, good question. I think the answer is yes, but I have to clarify. It's not what you mean by a smart brain. We don't have any computer today, and probably we won't have for a few decades that will be able to have consciousness. But at some point in the future, whether it's 30 years, I believe between 30 and 50 years, we will have, or 100 years, or let's say 1,000 years, at some point in the future, we will have computers that will have consciousness. I can actually explain that in a more elaborate way, but I won't, later if we have time, we can do that.
Next up is going to be Sarika, Cesar, and Jyoti. Sarika, go ahead.
Hi. So I was wondering, what is mindfulness and what parts of the brain does it really affect?
So mindfulness, I mean, I won't go into this a lot. There's another talk that I did, and there are talks you can read, from many other people also. Mindfulness in general is the concept of being present. And there's actually two, in my talk, I described there are two basic categories of mindfulness. So depending on how you look at it, depending on the type of training that you go through. But mindfulness is being aware of our own, of things inside of our mind. That's the simplest way to explain it.
Okay, let me see who was next up. Give me a second. Lost my track here. Cesar, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Sanjay. I wonder if some domestic animals, some high-level domestic animals, a cat or a dog, could they, some individuals of them, could they start to begin to develop a kind of a consciousness through being exposed to humans from so many generations? I ask this because there's now a silly kind of video in which the person has a virtual mask in the screen and is holding a cat or a dog, and the dog looks at the screen, or the cat looks at the screen and freaks out, and then looks back at the owner and freaks out because he sees that the owner in the screen has a mask, right? So it's a silly video, but it got me thinking that the cat and the dog in the video, they seem to know that they're looking at themselves and their owners, and they seem to know that their owners suddenly have this strange mask, so they look back. And I wonder if that's a sign of consciousness, and if so, because it doesn't happen with all the animals, I wonder if it's has to do with the fact that maybe through so many generations of cats and dogs living with humans and interacting with them, they're starting to develop some kind of lower level consciousness, or being aware of themselves, which is I wonder about that.
Yeah. I talked about some of this in some of the slides, but I didn't go in depth in it. But yeah, some animals can show. So consciousness has multiple types of presentation, multiple levels of behavior. And so if a dog or cat, or many animals for that matter, if they're showing the ability to recognize themselves, if they're showing the ability to recognize their owners, or their companions, whoever you call them, it probably is a sort of consciousness just below the full level of human consciousness. I mean, they probably are not able to understand that they're having a thought, or that their thoughts are existing in their brain, and that their owner has a different brain. Those levels of consciousness they don't have, but their self-awareness is something that many animals at some point do develop. Also, two concepts that are important for your question are that over the time of their life, they may learn through experiences themselves, as well as they may learn through socialization with other beings, other animals or other beings. And we do that. A lot of I believe that some of our higher levels of consciousness may actually be through learning that we experience through other people. So yeah, this is we may be seeing some of that in animals.
Sanjay, we have about 40 minutes left. How long is your second presentation?
I can do that in about maybe 20 minutes.
20 minutes. So let's go ahead and do the second presentation, and then we will go to takeaways.
Okay, let me, if you just give me 1 second, let me,
sure.
I just had to,
Folks, the questions are fantastic, but I want to make sure that we get second part of Sanjay's presentation. He's doing an entire series, so we're keeping track of all the questions, and they're going to inspire future full meetups on these questions. Okay. Jyoti, you have a quick question? Just go ahead. Just one quick. Go ahead.
Sanjay, in the hospice patients, they give morphine to speed up the process. Does morphine also dampen the consciousness, or just the organs? How does it work in terms of consciousness?
Yeah. Go ahead. I don't know if you're finished. Or...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sanjay, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah. So a lot of opioids, what they do, morphine is a pretty strong opioid. I believe it's an opioid. So what happens is that they tend to completely reduce neural functioning on a broad scale. Almost all neurons get attenuated. Their activity gets attenuated from a lot of these neurotropic drugs. And so it is, in a sense, yes, that they're losing, the person is losing consciousness, but it's actually that all of their brain activity is being reduced. So it's more than just the loss of consciousness. I mean, the loss of consciousness may be a side effect that their brain is turning off slowly. You know, it's not that morphine acts on those centers of the brain that activate, that work on consciousness. It's that morphine acts on all areas of the brain, but not just all areas of the brain, it works on all neural cells, including nerves. That's the reason why pain sensation goes away, because all nerve fibers, which are basically parts of, they are neurons, all nerve activity is reduced. Hopefully, I think that answered.
Folks, sorry for interrupting the questions, but we want to go ahead. Sanjay, go ahead and start the PowerPoint. We want to cover as much ground as possible, but realize that this is an entire series to be continued, and we're going to use that. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Yes, so let me,
and the reason I'm hurrying up is that we have got a meetup coming up at 2:30 Eastern time. So that is 35 minutes from now on art and philosophy. And let me just tell you about it, because I won't have time at that time. That's going to be, the topic is going to be, it's called sense of life. You know, how do we actually hold our philosophy? How is it that, you know, we kind of actually hold the philosophy in our subconscious or unconscious, so we react to art. we react to people, we react to various things. So it's going to look at this concept of sense of life, which is like the preconceptual, automatized way in which we hold philosophy and use philosophy. So that's what it's going to be starting at 2:30. Over to you, Sanjay. So Sanjay will do a presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we will do takeaways after that. Go ahead.
Okay. So let me just start again. So hopefully you can see the slides.
Yes.
Okay. So here's another quote by William James. He's considered the father of American psychology. My experience is what I agreed to attend to. So, he's talking about experience, but he was basically talking about consciousness, that there's an agreement, that there's an awareness that we have to have about attention, about attending to. And this is another aspect of that many people believe. So let me go into, there are two scenarios that I want to talk about here, two examples that I want to give for consciousness. And these are basically, I was trying to, so is the slide visible? Can you see just the scenario one? Right, you can see scenario.
Yes, I see scenario one.
Okay, so what I'll do is I don't have a talk, I don't have a slides for this, so I'm going to talk through this with notes that I have on this. So in this scenario, what I want to do is I want to describe, so first I want to describe two scenarios about consciousness to give us an additional perspective on what consciousness means. So let's take a scenario that's just born, just after birth. Let's say they're 5 days old, and this infant does not even know that it's capable of knowing things. Right? It's just born. It doesn't even know that it can change the world. Right? It doesn't know that it can manipulate the world. That it can reach out and grab something. It doesn't know how to even move its eyes or its arms. Right? I had mentioned that its eyes have not learned to focus. Similarly, it has not learned how to move its arms because movement requires the brain to learn how to manipulate specific muscles, sending signals to specific nerves that activate specific muscle groups and move those muscles in coordinated fashion to exercise very sophisticated or even simple movements. That 5-day-old infant has not learned these things, and the baby has to learn that. Just as we know that a baby has to learn how to walk, the baby has to, in the beginning, learn how to move its arm, even to grab or to point at mommy or daddy, or even to have its eye focus. It has to learn how to use the focusing mechanism that the muscles in its eyes need to change the shape of its lens so that it can see things and focus distant objects or focus on nearby objects. So there's much that the baby doesn't have. The baby is just a very, in a sense, primitive human because it hasn't developed a lot of these abilities. So typically what happens in a baby in a situation like that is that it will have a distress, right? For example, its diaper may become wet, or it may be uncomfortable about something, right? Its skin may be sensitive. It may smell the smell from its diaper, and that may activate its fear center because, or disgust center, things like that. And the baby will not know what to do. It won't have a sensation. It won't have a sense of what's happening. Baby only knows that it has distress. It has a feeling of distress in its body somehow. It doesn't even know that its mind has a feeling of body. It doesn't differentiate between its mind and its body, right? Because a baby at that age doesn't understand. And these are things that neuroscientists believe. I'm not saying that this is a fact, but this is the considered assessment today of an infant. Now, it's possible that a baby from even before birth is fully cognizant and fully aware, or maybe many other things, but neuroscientists don't believe that. The current understanding is that these things emerge, these conceptions of the world, even the concept that the baby exists in a world emerges in the baby after some time period. It doesn't emerge instantly after birth. So a 5-day-old baby will not have the awareness that it has a mind or that its mind is sensing this discomfort. It doesn't even know that it has a body. It doesn't know that its body is sensing this discomfort, because just like an insect can't see its own body, that infant cannot see its whole body. It's probably never seen its whole body to even have awareness that it is a body, okay? Because it can't move its neck at that point, right? It has not learned how to move its neck. If you hold a baby, its neck will kind of flop around. So there's many aspects that the baby cannot do at that time. So if this baby has this discomfort, what happens, right? its autonomic system, after a certain while, after the discomfort becomes above a certain threshold, it will start to cry, because autonomically, our bodies are hardwired through our genetics. It's hardwired to start to cry in certain situations, right? When we have extreme discomfort or we have certain problems that we cannot solve ourselves. And the baby doesn't see it as a problem. The baby just has this physiological sense something's not right, and it begins to cry, right? So what happens is that a parent will come and help the baby then, right? Typically, the parent will come and they may notice that the baby has wet its diaper, and they'll start to change the diaper. And after that happens, the parent will interact with the baby. So this interaction will soothe the baby, right? The baby will also, through these interactions, the baby will start to bond with the parent, because the baby is able to smell the parent. We humans have smells. Everything, in the world most things in the world have smells. So in one sense, the baby is smelling the parent. That's one of the first ways that it learns to recognize its parent, not through sight, because its visual system has not developed fully, and its lens is not focusing yet. So it learns to recognize through smell and sound and other techniques. So it's learning to bond with the parent while the parent is changing the baby's diaper and the parent is touching the baby and soothing it. So this baby starts to get the realization. Okay? Now, it's not a realization in terms of a thought. This is not a thought. What I mean by realization is that it's an association, just like, for some of you who may have heard about, read about Pavlovian learning, right? Association, behavioral association, that the baby is starting to associate the parent with comfort. Okay, so in one sense, the baby starts to like the parent and starts to trust the parent. Also, another thing that the baby will start to associate over time, as the parent changes the diaper more and more, is that the baby will learn to associate that the parent is able to soothe the baby. Okay, and the baby will learn to associate that the concept of soothing is possible. It will learn to associate the concept of soothing by another person. It will start to realize that soothing is possible and that its parent is doing the soothing. That when the parent appears, the baby feels better. And when the parent goes away, the baby may not feel better. So these are some of the most fundamental lessons you can say that the baby learns, not by the parent teaching the baby, but they're just the parent's existence and the interaction with the baby, right? So the baby starts to learn these things. One of the first fundamental things that the baby learns to do after this is that it is possible to do things in the world. For example, the baby has discomfort, and the baby learns that that discomfort can be alleviated. Okay, it doesn't know how to alleviate, but it learns first that alleviation of discomfort is possible. And the way to do it is by calling out, yelling, crying. The parent comes and the parent does something, right? And eventually what the baby learns, though, after that, after it grows a few more months and after it's had its diaper changed a few hundred times, is that maybe we can do this ourselves. Okay? And this is I believe, the initiation of what I might say is the lower level forms of consciousness, of human consciousness. And probably in animals also, they may have this initial level of consciousness also. And that is that they're able to recognize that they can soothe themselves. Once a living thing recognizes that they can soothe itself, it becomes more powerful because it realizes that it is an active agent in the world. It has agency in the world, right? That not only am I this helpless being, that all I can do is cry for help and attention, that I can actually do active things to help myself. If my head flops over, I can use my muscles and turn my head so that I'm looking, right? But a baby who hasn't learned that, when its head flops over, it doesn't even know that it can do that, let alone, let's say that it's learned how to move its head. If it hasn't learned that it can actually do that, then it's at a disadvantage. But once it learns that it can actually manipulate its body and in the future manipulate the world, it's become more powerful. Now, one of the elemental things that every human, I believe, and many of the advanced animals also learn is not only they can manipulate its body and the world, but it can also manipulate the inside of its mind. Okay? And this is a very important concept. I'm not going to get into elaboration in this. It's extremely important. Maybe we'll do another talk on this element alone. But this scenario is just, I want to introduce this concept initially so that you can start thinking about it. And we'll talk about it in more detail later. So once this baby starts to realize that somebody can alleviate its distress, okay? Then as the baby grows, during the first year of its life, what it realizes is that it can alleviate its own mental distress, not just physical distress, because the example I started with is physical distress. But if the baby has mental distress, emotional distress, for example, And actually, many physical distresses also have mental distress associated with them. So for example, if the baby's hungry, right, even after the baby has been fed, okay, if the baby is in a neglectful situation, let's say that it's an orphan, it's in an orphanage, okay, if the baby just is given food and a bottle, and it's given something to feed off of, even after the baby has filled its stomach, and there's a delay between when the stomach realizes it's full and the mind realizes it's full. So let's say after 20 minutes, the baby realizes its stomach is full. The baby still wants something, right? It wants attention, it wants comfort, it wants love and touching, right? Sensations. But that baby will not get that. So there will still be a discomfort in its mind that's an emotional discomfort, right? It may want to be loved, not just to be fed, to be held, not just to be, rocked. So these are things that the baby realizes that it needs to have comfort from. And most babies, when they see that their parent holds the baby and rocks the baby to sleep, through association, it learns that these things happen. And in a sense, it learns that it can do it itself. So as the baby grows older, especially after the first year of life, it learns how to, and the way it learns is actually kind of experimental. This is what happens in many areas of the world. When you have any kind of sophisticated systems behave in the beginning randomly. So when a baby's neurons are firing randomly, it will randomly do different things that it doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't know. So at the beginning, for example, when we talked about the baby kind of flailing, some of that is random flailing, that the neurons are randomly firing, and some of those randoms happen to cause activation of certain muscle groups that cause those muscles to twitch. And that's random behavior. But similarly, there may be random behavior at the conscious level, you can say, at the awareness level. So when that starts to happen, what will happen is that the baby will learn through time, through months, that some of these random neural patterns of soothing behavior actually helps itself. It no longer misses its parent, like maybe it woke up in its crib and the parent isn't there. Well, early on, babies, when they wake up, they cry immediately after waking up. But after a certain few weeks, sometimes a few months, baby learns it doesn't have to cry for the parent eventually will come. And the reason why the baby doesn't cry is because the baby at that point has learned to self-soothe itself. After it wakes up, it has, and some of this may be automatic, it may be a learned automatic response, not autonomous, but it may be learned automatic in the sense that after it wakes up, it learns to soothe itself and comfort itself and have hope that its parent will come. Okay. So this is one scenario that I wanted to give an example of, where the concept of awareness is that the baby learns to be aware of mental states inside of its brain, that this attentional center, or the focus of the attentional center in the baby's brain, has activated by a certain age, let's say age 1. We don't know exactly what age, but let's assume it's age 1. And from age 1, it starts to do simple experiments. These are random experiments. It's not that it's acting out and doing sophisticated experiments. These are just randomly occurring in its brain. But through these random events that happen, it eventually learns and figures out that when this attentional center queries, it kind of looks at this other center and looks at this other center, and it's able to figure out this center is stressed, and it can do something. And eventually, through other random behaviors, it figures out that it can alleviate that stress, or just by giving attention to it, the stress goes away, the stress disappears. Just by focusing on the fact that it's missing its parent, the focusing on that may cause it not to miss the parent anymore. So these are things that it learns. So one of the concepts of awareness, we believe, is that when our brain is able to look at itself, at different parts of itself intentionally, and realize the state that it's in, realize the mood that it's in, that's an aspect of awareness, of consciousness. And a more sophisticated level is when it's able to soothe itself, because soothing is something very important that we do to ourselves. So that's the first scenario that I wanted to talk about. Another scenario is, actually, let me just go through my notes to see if I've left something out. Probably.
Sanjay, we got about 20 minutes before the next meetup starts, so we should wrap up in about 10 minutes if we can.
Yeah. This next one is shorter. So this next one is actually, the next scenario is more along the lines of an adult waking up after anesthesia. So some of you had raised this as a question. And so this is an example where an adult has undergone surgery. They're under deep anesthesia and deep sleep, and they wake up, right? So and this may happen at other times. It may not be just anesthesia. It may be that they've had long sleepless nights as a student who's studying for an exam and they haven't studied, they've stayed up for 2 nights in a row. Or it may be somebody that went to a party, they got drunk and they passed out and they're now waking up. However you see it, the person is waking up and they're disoriented, right? So what happens in the person when we're disoriented? So one of the first things that happens is that we realize we've lost touch, right? We've been out of touch with reality in the sense that our mind does not realize what happened just preceding our awakeness, right? We realize that
Sanjay, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we've got only about 20 minutes, and I think it would be really good for us to hear from everybody to see what they are walking away with, so we'll be able to plan the future meetups better.
Sure.
So can we incorporate this into the next version?
Sure. Yeah.
Or you can wrap it. You can take about maybe 3 minutes to wrap it up, and then let's open it up for takeaways. What do you think?
I'll just quickly wrap it up. Basically, I mean, the gist of this is that consciousness and awareness relies on our mind actively doing things. Okay. So in the first scenario, when I talked about the baby learns to actively investigate the areas of its mind, this is what the adult does this automatically because it's learned it in infancy. It's such a instinctual, almost instinctual. It's not instinctual, but it's a learned behavior, but it seems to be almost instinctual because it was learned at such a young age that we do this all the time. So a lot of what we do in consciousness may be learned behavior, learned from other people and also learned through our experiences. So those are the two scenarios that I wanted to go off of. So actually, let me just close with this thought. So consciousness is the brain's imperfect picture of its own activity. Okay? This is the quote that a neuroscientist and an educator, he gave about, there's actually a video that if you want, I can reference. But this to me is the simplest explanation of what consciousness is. And it seems to be most accurate. But it's where the brain is looking at its own activity, but the brain doesn't have a perfect understanding of its own activity, and that this explains a lot of the good and the bad parts of consciousness.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sanjay. Next time I'll plan to schedule it so that there is more time, because you have such amazing things to say that I don't, I really want to give you the full time to do that, but I think it'll be good to hear from everybody. So folks, it's time for takeaways. You get only 1 minute, so try to be as brief as you possibly can. So the question is, what are you walking away with from this? Take the largest view you can. So it's going to be Priya, Katan, Jair, and Vanessa next. Priya, give me just a second. I need to do something here. All right, Priya. So it's going to be Priya, Katan, and Jair next. Priya.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, mine is a question. I don't know if this is a good time to ask.
No questions. Just what are you walking away with? What did you think of this?
Amazing. I mean, there's lots more questions I have, so I think I'm looking forward to rewatching this. Sorry.
Excellent. And questions is the most valuable thing you can walk away with. So you're walking away with the best things. Next up is going to be, let me see. It's going to be Katan, Jair, and Vanessa. Katan.
Yes, of course, excellent as always, but this is not a negative comment, but I was expecting kind of like a holistic approach to consciousness where philosophy, psychology. So I guess from this point of view, neuroscience seems to be very much physical, biological. So how to tie that in, maybe I will start from the advanced stage of consciousness where I can say, I can think, I exist. Then from that point, we jump off and say, do I have it?
Katan, I would recommend watching the 3 videos that he already has done and attending the monthly meetups that we are going to be doing all next year. And we will be covering this from many, many different angles. It can't be covered. It's such a complex topic, can't be covered in just one. Next up is Jair, Vanessa, Linda, and Regine. Jair, Vanessa, and Linda.
Yeah, mine was a question as well, but I can't do that. So yeah, I just appreciate what you guys did. It's I really like that it's science based. You don't have all the answers. I really like that.
Let's do one thing. Let's do one thing. Everybody has questions, so you can put the questions on the table for everybody else. We won't answer the questions, but let's have your question, please.
You want me to type it?
No, you can say it. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is I know you, well, I don't know if you're going to answer it, but I'm wondering stimulus response. Sanjay addressed it briefly, but I'm wondering sometimes stimulus response seems, for example, in a classroom, if a teacher reinforces.
No, please. Sorry. Please make it short. Just ask a question, and we will take away the questions. So we will actually use the questions to formulate the next meetups.
Okay, so stimulus response, does it have a location in the brain versus consciousness?
Wonderful. Priya, what was your question?
What level of consciousness exists when you're on autopilot, and how the second one is like you had mentioned, like the different ages, like in infant and different months. How about are there any studies on like as an adult between like teenager and at like various ages, like across what?
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up, Vanessa, Linda, and Sarika. Folks, keep the takeaways and questions very short. Vanessa, go ahead. Vanessa, you need to unmute. Okay, next up is Linda.
Thank you, Sanjay, for this has been very interesting, and I look forward to learning a lot more about neurosciences.
Wonderful, thank you, Linda. Next up is Sarika.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really intrigued by the scenario 1 of the infant and look forward to learning more about how people can learn to self-nurture themselves even after times of trauma, even if we're hardwired as children to receive that from others.
Excellent, thank you. Next up is Michael, Lisa, and Jyoti. Michael.
Yeah, fascinating. As someone said, imagine covering the whole of consciousness is one session.
Yes.
So I'm super fascinated to delve more into this. I just halfway through Lisa Feldman Barrett's new book, 7.5 Lessons for a Brain. I can really recommend it. She sums up many of the science of neuroscience and consciousness in that.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Lisa, Jyoti, and Jairo. Lisa.
Yes, just reminding me again that consciousness is really a hard problem, and I just really appreciate this perspective, shall we say, multi-possibility look at trying to come up with some kind of awareness of what it is. Thank you.
Wonderful. Next up is Jyoti, Jairo, and Ash.
Yeah, Sanjay, it was an awesome presentation. I loved it. What I loved the most was I'm glad that you started with the evolution process, how the consciousness first came into being, and then you connected it with what we have now. So that makes it very easy to understand consciousness. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Jairo and Ash. Okay, I think you have typed your takeaway. Go ahead.
Yes, I can read it right quick. If consciousness is the brain's imperfect picture, then when we are doing mindfulness, aren't we also generating like a series of imperfect pictures in the forms of what we were doing just a second ago? That's according to my definition of mindfulness, which is like remembering what one is doing. Then couldn't that be applied to a machine, like have it remember what it was just doing, and then it would be conscious?
Thank you. Next up is Ash and Jonathan. Ash.
Yeah, my biggest takeaways are just how there are different levels of consciousness or awareness, almost like a spectrum, but that higher order levels of organization emerge at different stages of the evolution of consciousness, and also that consciousness isn't either evenly distributed across the brain or arises from a centralized locus, but is more of a complex combination of the two. So I found that really interesting. So thank you, Sanjay.
Excellent, Ash. Next up is Jonathan.
Yeah, I guess my main takeaway is that this sort of I'm reminded of the relationship between knowledge and experience, and that we're constantly empirically discovering more things, and it's driving our generation of knowledge. And this is sort of like a cyclical thing. So, as mentioned before, there was a study brought up, and Sanjay was saying like this was sort of, we know a lot more now, and sort of we've generated more knowledge. I see this as still in the very early stages of that. And what we're hearing today is the generation of a lot of new empirical data that can help drive more knowledge.
Okay, last one is Sarika. Sarika, go ahead.
Oh, I already went, but thank you.
Oh, okay. You've typed a question, so okay, that's good. So Sanjay will have a look at it. Sanjay, any closing thoughts? You got about 3 minutes.
Sure. So I enjoyed this a lot. I mean, excellent questions as usual. For me, that's one of the most interesting parts, because I get to see perspective from other people and what they're interested in. Some of the questions that people asked, I think we will more than likely go into in subsequent talks. What I wanted to close with is that yes, I mean, neuroscience it's looking at many areas of not only human behavior but behavior in general across all intelligent or thinking semi-intelligent beings. But the concepts that have been found as far as consciousness, they seem to be pretty primitive, but if you take them all as a whole, they actually have far-reaching consequences, and they actually explain a lot more than most people will realize. What we understand about our level of consciousness and how we operate is understood to some extent already. It's not that we're just starting out and we understand very little. We actually have learned a lot. I mean, from the 1990s, we've learned a lot since then. And there's a lot of data behind this understanding. It's not that this understanding is just a few scientists who've come up with theories, and these theories are what people believe. No. It's that specific areas have been looked at. Many specific areas have been looked at by multiple groups of scientists over time. There have been questions and discussions and challenges posed, and those challenges have been remedied by additional studies that have looked in more detail about things that people speculated may not be happening, things like that. Some of this we went into in the talk today when people asked. So it's actually a robust set of information that we have about it. It's not that consciousness is little understood, but there's a lot more for us to understand also. It's a very broad area.
Wonderful. And Sanjay, really look forward to the series.